Hey, how's it going? It's a rainy day here where I live, so I figured I would sit down and film a quick little video for you guys. I'm sitting here in my library, both of my dogs are in here, so if you hear some tip tapping, that's them. I didn't want them out there in case it thunders and they start barking and things like that. So today we're going to be going over a stack of books that I have here, and these are the books that I read so far in 2025. I've already talked about a couple of them, so I'm not going to go too much in depth with them. Just kind of let you know what I read, maybe some thoughts, and a couple of them I plan on reading a passage or two. So we'll start with one that I've already discussed, and that is the Decameron by Giovanni Boccaccio. So this is the story of some citizens of Florence who go to the countryside to tell some stories while they try to escape from the plague. Like I said before, I enjoyed it. It was a pretty easy read. Went through it pretty quickly. A lot of the stories have to do with trickery, lust, things along those lines. Honestly, as I look back on it, after it's been about 2 months now since I've read it, and I don't think I'll ever reread it again. I don't really take anything away from it, but it was just an enjoyable read. I enjoyed it while I was reading it. Next, we have the collected plays or dramatic works of Samuel Beckett. So not only is this stage plays, but this includes things that were made for radio and made for TV as well. So I cheated a little bit, and in my Goodreads counted this as 3 books. I counted Waiting for Godot as one, Endgame as one, and then the collected shorter plays as another. If I had to rank them, I would put Endgame first. I already talked about this in an earlier video, but I thought it was just a little bit more complete. And maybe a little bit more perfect than Waiting for Godot. But Waiting for Godot is obviously a masterpiece, and if it gets more acclaim, that's probably because it is the better play. But I just liked Endgame a little bit more than Waiting for Godot. Really nothing stood out to me too much. Happy Days was pretty good from the shorter works, but I feel like a lot of them had a lot of stage directions and things along those lines. So I think they would benefit a lot from seeing them or hearing them like they were intended rather than just reading them off the page. I will probably read, or I'll definitely reread Waiting for Godot and Endgame again. Maybe some of the shorter plays, but I don't really plan on delving into a lot of the shorter plays again. Maybe I'll look them up on YouTube and see if there's any videos or things of them being performed live. Next, we go into an author I've never read before, but I picked him up. I've heard a lot about him. He won the Nobel Prize, and that is J.M. Coetzee, or Coetzee. South American author, won the Nobel Prize. The first book that I read by him was Disgrace, which is kind of the story of a man who brings himself to the brink of disaster, or kind of the drudges of his life based on his own mistakes, and as he reconciles this and works through it, he spends time with his daughter. They undergo some trauma together, and really it was a really heartbreaking book. It's been a while since I've been as this affected by a book emotionally. I definitely like this one better than the one that I am going to talk about next. So I would really recommend Disgrace. Of my 2 experiences with J.M. Coetzee, this is the one I would recommend over The Life and Times of Michael Kay, which we'll talk about next. I do plan on reading more. I've heard good things about Foe, which I believe is a retelling of Robinson Crusoe, or a telling from like another character's perspective or something like that. But I plan on reading Robinson Crusoe before I delve into that one. So as I've alluded to, we do have The Life and Times of Michael Kay, which was published before Disgrace. I believe this was in the early to mid 80s, while Disgrace, I believe, was 1999. But kind of a similar theme between the two. They follow a man in the dredges of his life as he's kind of just trying to come back from the wreckage. I will say that Michael Kay is a lot more content where he is than the protagonist in Disgrace. But this one it kind of drug at some points as he was traveling back and forth from different areas. I found myself kind of meandering in my thoughts rather than staying engrossed in the story. Really enjoy his prose in both of these works. I think that's the reason I'm going to come back to them, as well as the emotional pull and tug that I felt from Disgrace. There is a passage from this book that I was planning on reading, just to give you an example of his prose a little bit. So, Ducking through the fences, he could feel a craftsman's pleasure in wire spanning so taut that it hummed when it was plucked. Nonetheless, he could not imagine himself spending his life driving stakes into the ground, erecting fences, dividing up the land. He thought of himself not as something heavy that left tracks behind it, but if anything as a speck upon the surface of the earth, too deeply asleep to notice the scratch of ant feet, the rasp of butterfly teeth, the tumbling of dust. I really like the second half of that quote. Next we have Ethan Frome by Edith Wharton. This is the second Edith Wharton that I've read, first one being Age of Innocence, which I mentioned before I wasn't a huge fan of. Like this one a lot more. It's a shorter work. I found the prose more, I guess, less dense, which not necessarily is always a good thing. I'm not saying that dense works aren't good, but I found it a little bit distracting from other things going on in Age of Innocence. Whereas in Ethan Frome, I felt like it fit the pace of the story perfectly. There's some scenes in here that kind of live in my memory, even a month or two after reading it. I think the interaction between Ethan, his wife's cousin, and the cat, specifically the way the cat behaves and kind of acts as a wedge in their relationship, was really interesting, and kind of representing the presence of his wife even when she was gone. I thought it was really interesting. There is a passage I pointed out in this one, and this kind of, I think, is a good introduction to the novel. It kind of displays Ethan's idea, or his mindset. His father's death and the misfortunes following it had put a premature end to Ethan's studies, but though they had not gone far enough to be of much practical use, they had fed his fancy and made him aware of huge, cloudy meanings behind the daily face of things. I like those last couple words there, the huge, cloudy meanings behind the daily face of things. Just that in everyday life, things are not what they seem, and that there is exponentially more behind everything, especially people, than we could possibly see with our eyes. Next up is Wide Sargasso Sea by Jean Rhys. This is a kind of a prequel to Jane Eyre. It talks about, spoiler for Jane Eyre, it talks about the woman in the attic before she became the woman in the attic, and really enjoyed this novel. Not as much as some of the other ones that I've talked about so far. I think I liked Edith Wharton and the Coetzee books better, but it was an enjoyable read. A lot going on here when it looks at like power dynamics, feminism, post-colonialism, and kind of the power dynamics they have of the oppressor controlling the narrative to control the oppressed. Really throughout the entire novel, I kind of found those themes interweaving and kind of working together, the feminism and post-colonialism. Next we have Brideshead Revisited. This was my second WA book, behind A Handful of Dust. I think I liked Handful of Dust better, but I did enjoy this one as well. It's about a man, what's his name? Captain Charles Ryder. So he's a captain in the army. He's stationed at, he moves to a new station by the army's directives, and it ends up being a place from his past. And then he reflects back on his past and the times that he spent there at Brideshead, which is the mansion or the establishment. I did want to read one passage where, to kind of demonstrate his prose for you, so you know what you're getting into. And a description that I really enjoyed. Julie wore the embroidered Chinese robe, which she often used when we were dining alone at Brideshead. It was a robe whose weight and stiff folds stressed her repose. Her neck rose exquisitely from the plain gold circle at her throat. Her hands lay still among the dragons in her lap. It was thus that I had rejoiced to see her nights without number, and that night, watching her as she sat between the firelight and the shaded lamp, unable to look away for love of her beauty, I suddenly thought, when else have I seen her like this? Why am I reminded of another moment of vision? And it came back to me that this was how she had sat in the liner, before the storm. This was how she had looked, and I realized that she had regained what I thought she had lost forever. The magical sadness which had surely drawn me to her, the thwarted look that had seemed to say, surely I was made for some other purpose than this. Next up, we have The Anatomy of Melancholy. So I've already talked about this on a couple videos, but this is a early 1600s novel, or not a novel, more of a textbook, a medical textbook about the anatomy. So talking about the causes, prognosis, presentation, and cures of melancholy, or really clinical depression. This is an all-encompassing novel, so any different angle that Robert Burton could think of to talk about this topic, he definitely explored it and beat it to death. I found myself really enthralled with certain portions of the novel, and then certain portions of the novel I was just kind of ready for them to end. But overall, this is not something that I will reread. It was a beast of a novel, biggest novel that I've ever read. And I did mark out quite a few passages that I plan to reread eventually when I feel the need to. But I don't think I'll ever sit down and reread this entire novel again. There is one quote that I wanted to read, but I forgot to mark it out. I think here it is. We'll read it, and if it's the one I was talking about, I'll tell you, and if not, it's still a good passage because I highlighted it, at least in my opinion. And you're here for my opinions. A poor sheep stealer is hanged for stealing of victuals, compelled peradventure by necessity of that intolerable cold, hunger, and thirst, to save himself from starving. But a great man in office may securely rob whole provinces, undo thousands, pill and pull, oppress ad libitum, flay, grind, tyrannize, enrich himself by spoils of the commons, be uncontrollable in his actions, and after all, be recompensed with turgent titles, honored for his good service, and no man dare find fault or mutter at it. So, the tyranny of the rich was a thing back then as well. And then the praising of the rich for their tyranny. Not to get political on my channel. But last book that I have read this year is The Moon and Sixpence by W. Somerset Maugham. W. Somerset Maugham, I've mentioned quite a bit. He's becoming one of my favorite authors. This is the third book by him that I have read. And it really, all his books are pretty similar. They kind of follow an artist or a man on a journey of enlightenment as he goes to pursue whatever it is he's passionate about in his life. And there's philosophical musings on beauty and art and the meaning of life throughout. And other people struggling to understand why. In this case, it's a kind of a retelling of the life of Paul Gauguin, Gauguin. This is his a self-portrait that he wrote, who was a man who abandoned the life that he had to pursue a desire or a necessity to paint. So this is a much more harsh retelling of his life. It makes him come off as heartless, and the only thing that he was devoted to was his painting, to the point where he did not care at all for any human interaction or the effects that he had on other people's lives, which from the introduction that I read is not true of Paul. In real life, he was not as terrible of a person, but it did make for a fascinating read. And there's a couple passages that I want to read. They're pretty short. So the first one is, only the poet or the saint can water an asphalt pavement in the confident anticipation that lilies will reward his labor. Sorry for the mucus noises in my voice. I'm getting over a cold. And then the following passage, this is a quote from one of the characters in the novel, who's he is a victim of Charles Strickland, who's the stand-in for Paul Gauguin. But despite his victimhood, he can't help as an observer of beauty but be in awe of the things that Charles Strickland does. And even though Charles Strickland continuously kind of ruins his life, he still can't bring himself to hate the man because of maybe he might hate the man, but he tolerates the man for the art that he produces. So here's a quote. Why should you think that beauty, which is the most precious thing in the world, lies like a stone on the beach for the careless passerby to pick up idly? Beauty is something wonderful and strange that the artist fashions out of the chaos of the world in the torment of his soul. And when he has made it, it is not given to all to know it. To recognize it, you must repeat the adventure of the artist. It is a melody that he sings to you, and to hear it again in your own heart, you want knowledge and sensitiveness and imagination. So that's the books that I've been reading this year. Let me know what you've been reading. If you've read any of these books, I'd love to hear your thoughts. I am currently reading The Brothers Karamazov. I'm less than halfway through, but hopefully by the end of the day I'll be halfway through. We will see. That's maybe a little bit of an eager assumption. I still have maybe like 110 pages to get through. I'm halfway. So hopefully through the weekend I'll be halfway through. But I just want to thank you guys again for watching, and we will see you next time. See ya.